What if the most powerful medicine your body has ever needed was never invented inside a laboratory, never patented by a corporation, never printed on a prescription pad with a list of side effects longer than the condition it was meant to treat? What if it was already recorded, commanded, and celebrated in the oldest text most of us have held since childhood? Every year we pour billions of dollars into supplements, wellness products, and functional drinks that promise to fix what modern living keeps breaking. Meanwhile, the biblical world had already mapped out a drink for nearly every condition that is destroying people's health today: heart disease, liver damage, chronic inflammation, gut dysfunction, hormonal disruption, cognitive decline. The drinks we are walking through today are not old folk remedies wrapped in religious language. They are compounds and preparations now being examined in peer-reviewed journals, university research programs, oncology departments, and cardiovascular medicine. Science is catching up to something that was written down thousands of years ago, and the convergence, when you look at it honestly, is difficult to explain away. Stay with me all the way to the end. Drink number 10 is the one that will stop you cold. It appears at the most pivotal moment in all of Scripture, and what researchers have found about its specific compounds is something I have been wanting to share for a long time. Drink number 1: ginger and honey brew. Proverbs chapter 24, verse 13 states it plainly: "Eat honey, for it is good." The land God promised His people is called more than 20 times across the Old Testament a land flowing with milk and honey. Jonathan's eyes brightened visibly in the middle of a military campaign the moment he found wild honey in a forest and ate it. Honey was not a luxury in the biblical world. It was medicine, daily provision, and a sign of divine favor that people mourned when they lost access to it. But in the traditional medicine of the ancient Near East, honey was almost never consumed alone. The most effective preparations combined it with aromatic spices and roots. The trade networks that connected biblical Israel to the broader ancient world brought ginger, known in Hebrew as zingiber, and referenced across rabbinic literature as a therapeutic staple, into everyday use inside the same culture that had built honey into its most sacred promises. The combination of raw ginger and raw honey in hot water is not a modern wellness invention. It is one of the oldest therapeutic preparations in human history, appearing independently in Egyptian medical papyri, in Ayurvedic tradition, and in the medicinal records of virtually every ancient civilization with access to both ingredients. What modern pharmacology has found about the synergy between these two substances is remarkable. Fresh ginger contains compounds called gingerols and shogaols that are among the most potent natural inhibitors of both COX2 and 5-LOX, inflammatory enzymes simultaneously. Most pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories target one pathway or the other. Ginger hits both at once. A study published in the journal Pain Medicine found ginger extract comparable to ibuprofen for reducing menstrual pain severity, with the ginger group reporting significantly fewer gastrointestinal side effects. Beyond inflammation, the 6-gingerol compound in fresh ginger suppresses nausea signals at the brainstem level through a mechanism distinct from pharmaceutical antiemetics, which is why oncology trials have found ginger supplementation effective at reducing chemotherapy-induced nausea. Raw honey adds more than sweetness. The defensin-1 protein creates an antimicrobial environment in both the upper respiratory tract and the digestive system simultaneously. The prebiotic oligosaccharides selectively feed beneficial gut bacteria, while the hydrogen peroxide generating enzyme system suppresses pathogenic strains. Hot water extracts both the gingerols from the root and the water-soluble antimicrobial compounds from honey in a single cup. There is a further dimension of this preparation that most people overlook entirely. Hot water temperature matters. Research on gingerol extraction has found that steeping fresh ginger in water between 80 and 90 degrees Celsius, just below boiling, extracts the highest concentration of bioactive gingerols without degrading the more heat-sensitive shogaol compounds. The ancient world prepared this drink by pouring hot water over crushed ginger root, which is precisely the extraction method that modern analytical chemistry has determined to be optimal. They did not know why it worked best that way, but they knew it did, and they kept doing it the same way across generations and cultures, because the results were consistent enough to become tradition. Jonathan ate wild honey in a field, and his eyes brightened because his body recognized something real. The ancient world combined that same honey with the most medicinally active root in their trade networks and drank it daily. They did not need a clinical trial to confirm what thousands of years of observation had already told them. Drink number 2. Pomegranate juice. Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 2, contains a quietly significant line. The beloved says she would give her love the juice of her pomegranates to drink, not the fruit eaten by hand. Pressed juice, prepared deliberately and offered as an act of care. This distinction matters biochemically. Punicolagen, the compound most responsible for pomegranate's cardiovascular benefit, is found at its highest concentrations in the rind and white pith. Pressing whole pomegranates extracts those compounds into the juice in quantities that simply eating the seeds cannot replicate. The ancient preparation method turns out to be the one that delivers the most potent version of what the fruit contains. A study published in Clinical Nutrition followed patients with severe carotid artery stenosis over 3 years. The group drinking pomegranate juice daily saw their arterial plaque reduced by over 30%. The control group's plaque increased by 9% over the same period. 30% reduction against 9% increase from a juice. Beyond arterial health, pomegranate juice has shown activity against prostate cancer progression in human clinical trials. PSA, doubling time, the marker doctors use to track how aggressively prostate cancer advances, slowed dramatically in men who drank it daily. Researchers at UCLA described these results as among the most promising dietary interventions for prostate cancer they had examined. The beloved in Song of Solomon understood that pomegranate juice was something you offered to the person you cared about most. That intuition, preserved across thousands of years of human culture, turns out to have been tracking something biochemically precise the entire time. Drink number 3. Grape juice and wine. Genesis chapter 40 records the Pharaoh's cupbearer describing his dream to Joseph in an Egyptian prison. 3 branches of a grapevine, budding, blossoming, producing clusters of ripe grapes, which the cupbearer pressed directly into Pharaoh's cup. Fresh grapes, immediately pressed. The vine and the cup run from the earliest pages of Genesis to the final chapters of Revelation. The theological debate around fermented grape preparations is not what we are here for. What we are here for is what the grape itself contains. Resveratrol, concentrated in the skins of dark grapes, activates proteins called sirtuins that govern how your cells respond to stress, how efficiently they repair damaged DNA, and how aggressively they suppress the chronic low-grade inflammation underlying virtually every major degenerative disease of modern life. David Sinclair at Harvard, one of the most cited longevity researchers alive, considers sirtuin activation through plant compounds one of the most legitimate pathways to extending healthy human lifespan that science has identified. Fresh grape juice pressed from dark-skinned varieties without filtration delivers resveratrol, quercetin, and anthocyanins together in a form that research suggests is more bioavailable than supplemental forms taken in isolation. These compounds interact synergistically in ways that separating and encapsulating individual molecules does not replicate. Quercetin specifically has demonstrated the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier and directly protect neurons from the oxidative stress that precedes Alzheimer's disease. Population studies in Mediterranean regions where grape consumption has remained high across centuries consistently show lower rates of cognitive decline compared to Western populations who have moved away from whole food sources of these compounds. There is a further family of compounds in dark grape skins called oligomeric proanthocyanidins, sometimes abbreviated as OPCs, that have been studied extensively in European cardiovascular medicine for decades, but receive far less attention in mainstream nutrition discussions than they deserve. OPCs have demonstrated in clinical research the ability to improve the structural integrity of blood vessel walls, reduce capillary fragility, and protect collagen from degradation by the inflammatory enzymes that break it down over time. The French research cardiologist Jacques Mascalier, who first isolated OPCs from grape seeds in the 1940s, spent decades documenting their vascular protective effects in ways that cardiovascular researchers in Europe took seriously long before the rest of the world caught up. Pharaoh's cupbearer pressed fresh grapes directly into a cup. There is probably no preparation of this fruit that delivers more of what the grape actually contains. The intuition behind that act turned out to be sound. Drink number 4. Milk. Exodus chapter 3, verse 8. God speaks to Moses from the burning bush and describes where he is bringing his people, a land flowing with milk and honey. This phrase echoes through the Old Testament more than 20 times. It was the defining image of divine promise. Not gold, not armies, milk and honey. In a world before refrigeration, fresh milk required land, animals, care, and stability across seasons. Its presence meant you had arrived somewhere worth staying. What milk actually contains goes considerably further than most people expect. Raw or minimally processed milk contains fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and K2 in forms dramatically more bioavailable than synthetic versions. Vitamin K2, almost entirely absent from modern processed diets, is the compound that directs calcium into bones rather than allowing it to deposit in arterial walls, which is a primary driver of cardiovascular disease. The lactoferrin found in milk is an iron-binding glycoprotein with potent antimicrobial activity, demonstrated in research to inhibit the replication of both bacterial and viral pathogens through multiple mechanisms, including competing for the iron that bacteria require to proliferate. The whey proteins in milk contain the highest concentrations of cysteine of any dietary protein source. And cysteine is the rate-limiting precursor to glutathione, your body's master internal antioxidant. Without adequate cysteine, you cannot produce enough glutathione. And without glutathione, your cells cannot manage oxidative stress effectively. The land flowing with milk was not simply a poetic image of abundance. It was a description of a nutritional environment specifically suited to building strong bones, resilient immune systems, and bodies capable of withstanding the demands of ancient life. Drink number 5. Barley water. There is a drink so ancient and so woven into biblical civilization that it appeared on the tables of kings and in the rations of soldiers simultaneously. It required no orchard, no vineyard. It came from the most democratic crop in the ancient Near East, a grain that grew where others refused to, that fed nations through famine, and that God Himself chose as one of the 6 ingredients in the bread He commanded the prophet Ezekiel to eat. Ruth chapter 2 takes place entirely in a barley field. The timing of the whole book is anchored to the barley harvest. When Boaz sends Ruth home to Naomi, he fills her shawl with 6 measures of barley as a deliberate act of generous provision. Barley was currency. Barley was survival. And the water left after barley was soaked, simmered, and strained was one of the most commonly consumed therapeutic drinks across the entire ancient Mediterranean world. What barley water contains centers on a compound called beta-glucan, a soluble fiber that barley holds in higher concentrations than any other grain. When barley is simmered, beta-glucan leaches into the liquid in significant quantities. The FDA has approved an official health claim for beta-glucan on food labels, which does not happen without substantial clinical evidence behind it. Beta-glucan forms a viscous gel in the digestive tract that slows glucose absorption, flattening blood sugar spikes that drive insulin resistance, cardiovascular inflammation, and the metabolic dysfunction underlying type 2 diabetes. A meta-analysis in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, drawing on more than a dozen randomized controlled trials, found clinically significant reductions in LDL cholesterol across every population studied. The immune research on beta-glucan is where things become genuinely remarkable. Beta-glucan activates dectin-1 receptors on macrophages and natural killer cells, switching the innate immune system into a heightened state of readiness without triggering the inflammatory overreaction that damages healthy tissue. Researchers at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center have described this mechanism as one of the most elegant natural immune training compounds currently under investigation. There is one more property of barley water that ancient practitioners almost certainly observed without having the vocabulary to explain it. Barley contains the highest silica content of any cereal grain, and a significant portion of that silica leaches into the cooking water during prolonged simmering. Silica is the primary structural mineral for connective tissue, joint cartilage, skin elasticity, and the strength of hair and nails. The populations that consumed barley water as a daily staple were receiving regular bioavailable silica supplementation from a source that modern researchers are only now beginning to study systematically. The beautiful joints and strong connective tissue visible in skeletal remains from barley-eating ancient populations may have had a dietary explanation that no one thought to look for until recently. Ruth gleaned in that barley field because barley was what stood between her and starvation. The ancient world fermented it, ground it, baked it, and simmered it into water because every preparation gave something back to the body. The water left behind after cooking barley is not waste. It is where much of the medicine went. Drink number 6, vinegar and sour wine. This one will challenge your assumptions. Stay with it. Ruth chapter 2, verse 14. Boaz, the wealthy landowner who will become Ruth's kinsman redeemer, and through that lineage an ancestor of Jesus himself, invites Ruth to eat bread with his workers and dip it in the vinegar. Not wine, not water, vinegar. This was the shared drink of agricultural laborers across the ancient Near East. In the Roman world, it was called posca, a diluted sour wine used across all social classes as a daily beverage, a preservative, and a medicine. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 26, compares a lazy messenger to vinegar on the teeth, meaning this taste was familiar enough to every reader that Solomon used it as an immediate, universally understood reference. And, in the final hours of the crucifixion, when Jesus said he was thirsty, the soldiers offered him vinegar on a hyssop branch. This was not a cruel act. It was the standard field drink of the Roman military. They offered what they themselves drank. Fermented unpasteurized vinegar contains acetic acid as its primary active compound. Modern metabolic research has found that acetic acid directly activates an enzyme called AMPK, the master metabolic switch of your cells. AMPK activation signals your cells to burn fat for energy, increase insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammatory cytokine production, and suppress the cellular growth patterns associated with cancer initiation. A randomized controlled trial published in the journal Diabetes Care found that consuming 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar before a high-carbohydrate meal reduced post-meal blood sugar spikes by nearly 35% in subjects with insulin resistance. Post-meal blood sugar spikes are now understood as a primary driver of cardiovascular damage, accelerated aging, and metabolic disease progression. The laborers dipping bread in vinegar in Boaz's fields were receiving daily AMPK activation with every shared cup. The Roman soldiers had it as standard issue. The wisdom was distributed across the ancient world without anyone needing to understand the biochemical mechanism. They had simply watched what happened to the people who drank it regularly. What is worth pausing on is how consistent this pattern is across the ancient world. Vinegar preparations appear in Egyptian medical papyri. They appear in early Greek medical texts. They appear in traditional Chinese medicine, in Ayurvedic practice, and in the medicinal traditions of civilizations that had no contact with one another. Independent convergence on the same preparation across cultures, separated by thousands of miles, is a signal that should not be dismissed. When multiple ancient civilizations with no shared medical literature arrive at the same compound, independently, the modern world should probably pay closer attention than it has. Drink number 7. Hyssop tea. Psalm 51, verse 7. David's great prayer of repentance after his gravest moral failure. A psalm recited in synagogues and churches for 3,000 years. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Hyssop was the instrument of purification in the most significant rituals of Mosaic law. It was used to apply blood to the doorposts at the first Passover in Egypt. It was used in the cleansing ceremonies for those healed of skin disease. It was the branch used to offer vinegar to Jesus at the cross, the same plant at the Exodus, at the purification rites, and at Calvary. Its presence at each of those moments was deliberate. Hyssopus officinalis is a small aromatic plant native to the Middle East and Mediterranean basin. Prepared as a tea, it delivers a concentrated dose of compounds that researchers have only recently begun examining with the rigor they deserve. Europe has been ahead of this. Hyssop has remained in the official European pharmacopoeia far longer than it has received serious attention in American research. The essential oil of hyssop contains pinocamphone and isopinocamphone, both of which have demonstrated potent expectorant and bronchodilatory activity. Clinical herbalists in Europe use hyssop tea specifically for bronchitis, productive coughs, and upper respiratory congestion with outcomes documented in the peer-reviewed literature. Hyssop also contains one of the highest concentrations of rosmarinic acid of any plant in the mint family. Rosmarinic acid is a polyphenol with well-documented anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and neuroprotective properties. A study published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry found rosmarinic acid to be one of the most effective naturally occurring inhibitors of COX-2, the same enzyme targeted by pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories like celecoxib. David did not ask to be purified with just any plant. He named hyssop specifically because the ancient world had understood for generations that this particular plant did something extraordinary inside the human body. The purification language of Psalm 51 carries theological depth that scholars have explored for centuries. But beneath all of that is a simple, now verifiable fact. Hyssop tea is pharmaceutical-grade respiratory medicine and anti-inflammatory intervention. God built purification language around a plant that actually purifies. Drink number 8. Fig drink and fig water. Figs are woven so deeply into biblical civilization, they function almost as background constants. David's armies carried fig cakes as concentrated field rations. The image of sitting under your own fig tree was the biblical shorthand for peace and prosperity. But the fig tree gives us more than its fruit. In traditional Mediterranean and Middle Eastern practice, dating back at least 3,000 years, the water in which dried figs were soaked and preparations made from fig leaves were used as treatments for digestive disorders, skin conditions, respiratory ailments, and as a general restorative after illness. The fig infusion, dried figs steeped in hot water for an extended period, was a standard preparation in ancient Jewish and early Christian medicine. Its widespread, independent appearance across multiple ancient traditions is a pattern worth taking seriously. The soaking water of dried figs carries water-soluble polyphenols, including rutin and chlorogenic acid, along with significant quantities of the digestive enzyme physin. Rutin has been shown in clinical studies to reduce venous insufficiency, the condition where blood pools in the lower limbs because vein valves are failing. This is the underlying cause of varicose veins, leg swelling, and the venous ulcers that become increasingly common with age. Rutin strengthens capillary walls and improves the structural integrity of veins in ways now well documented in vascular medicine. Chlorogenic acid has demonstrated the ability to slow glucose absorption from the small intestine, reduce the liver's production of glucose between meals, and improve insulin sensitivity simultaneously, making fig preparations one of the most comprehensive natural blood sugar interventions currently documented in nutritional research. The fig was not simply a fruit eaten under a peaceful sky. Its water and concentrated preparations were carrying medicine through the ancient world in ways that people understood through long experience, before anyone had the tools to explain it molecularly. Drink number 9. Bone broth. Judges chapter 6 records the angel of the Lord appearing to Gideon while he threshes wheat in a winepress, hiding from the Midianites. Gideon prepares a meal. He brings a young goat, unleavened bread, and the broth from the meat is presented specifically, named deliberately, and poured out as part of the offering. The broth is not incidental. It is what is placed before the divine presence. In the ancient world, the liquid produced by simmering meat and bones for extended periods was considered medicine as much as food. The provisioning of Solomon's temple kitchens, the supply lines for David's army, the cooking described across the historical books of the Old Testament. All of it centered on preparations requiring the long, slow cooking of animal bones, joints, and connective tissue in water. This was not economy. It was deliberate nutritional practice. What emerges from bones and connective tissue after hours of simmering is a liquid dense with collagen-derived gelatin, proline, glycine, hydroxyproline, and glucosamine. Gelatin, when it enters the digestive tract, coats and soothes the intestinal lining in ways documented in gastroenterology research as genuinely therapeutic for leaky gut, inflammatory bowel conditions, and the intestinal permeability that allows partially digested proteins to enter the bloodstream and trigger systemic autoimmune responses. The ancient world consumed this substance daily. The modern world replaced it with processed bouillon cubes and artificial flavoring. Glycine, one of the most abundant amino acids in bone broth, is the primary precursor to glutathione, the body's master antioxidant. A clinical trial published in the journal Sleep and Biological Rhythms found that 3 grams of glycine before bed improved next-day cognitive performance, energy, and alertness in subjects who were even mildly sleep-deprived. The mechanism involves glycine's ability to lower core body temperature during sleep by redistributing blood flow to the extremities, facilitating the deep, restorative sleep stages the brain requires for repair and consolidation. Gideon poured his broth onto a rock, and fire consumed it. What he was honoring was something his culture had always understood to be precious. The long-cooked liquid from bones was not the leftover byproduct of making meat. It was the point. The bones were the medicine. And here is what the modern food industry did. It replaced 12 hours of slow simmering with a cube of dehydrated sodium, artificial flavoring, and maltodextrin. It sold that cube to billions of people as a substitute for what their great-grandparents had made instinctively. And then it expressed confusion about the epidemic of intestinal permeability, autoimmune dysfunction, poor sleep, and joint deterioration that followed. The ancient world did not make that trade. We made it on their behalf without asking. Drink number 10. The wine of the Last Supper. Here it is. The one I told you to stay for. And I want you to understand the weight of what we are discussing before we get to what researchers have found. Because the context is what makes the science impossible to set aside casually. Matthew chapter 26. The Passover meal. The night before the crucifixion. Jesus takes the cup, the third of the 4 traditional cups in the Passover Seder, the one called the cup of redemption, and he reframes the entire meal and, in Christian theology, the entire scope of human history. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. The wine in that cup was not a generic ancient beverage. It was a specific preparation at a specific ritual table, embedded with specific theological meaning, going back to the Exodus. The Passover wine was red. It was mixed with water, as was universal practice at Jewish ceremonial tables. It was consumed reclining, in the posture of a free person, to embody the passage from slavery to liberation. Here is what researchers have found in the past 2 decades about red wine compounds and the human nervous system, specifically about what happens to the brain under extreme acute stress. Resveratrol, the polyphenol concentrated in red grape skins, crosses the blood-brain barrier and directly activates a protein called SIRT1, which functions simultaneously as a cellular survival gene and a stress response coordinator. When the human body is under conditions of extreme physiological stress, the kind that trauma produces in cells throughout the nervous system simultaneously. SIRT1 activation triggers a protective cascade that reduces neuronal death, preserves mitochondrial function, and helps cells survive conditions that would otherwise destroy them. A study published in the journal Neurochemistry International found that resveratrol demonstrates neuroprotective activity specifically in the context of trauma-induced excitotoxicity, the mechanism by which extreme physical and psychological stress causes cascading neuronal death. The compound does not simply reduce inflammation broadly. It creates a protective environment in neurons that are under direct siege. And then there is quercetin, also concentrated in red wine and dark grape skins. Quercetin has been demonstrated to modulate GABA receptors in the brain, the same receptors targeted by pharmaceutical anti-anxiety medications, producing what researchers describe as a natural anxiolytic effect without the cognitive suppression that pharmaceutical GABA modulators cause. In a moment of psychological stress so extreme that the Gospel accounts describe Jesus sweating drops of blood, a condition modern medicine recognizes as hematidrosis, documented only under the most severe autonomic nervous system activation. The quercetin in that Passover cup would have been directly modulating the stress response pathways in his nervous system. I want to be precise and careful here about the boundary between what science can say and what theology says. I am not suggesting the wine of the Last Supper was selected for its neurochemistry. The theological meaning of that cup runs at a depth that biochemistry cannot measure. What I am suggesting is this: the God who designed the human nervous system, who understood cellular stress biology before any human being had the instruments to describe it, chose to mark the most significant moment in redemptive history with a drink that modern neuroscience is now documenting as one of the most powerful neuroprotective compounds available to the human brain under conditions of extreme physiological and psychological distress. The cup of the new covenant was held at a Passover table, commanded by the same God who decorated his priest's robes with pomegranates, who told Ezekiel precisely which grains to combine, who filled the promised land with olive oil and almonds and figs and grapes. There are no accidents in that room. There are no coincidences at that table. So here is where we stand. From ginger and honey brew to the wine of the Passover table, from pomegranate juice pressed in ancient orchards to vinegar drunk by field laborers in Bethlehem, from hyssop tea to bone broth poured out before an angel of the Lord. These are not random folk remedies kept alive by religious sentiment. They are a pharmacopoeia, a comprehensive and integrated nutritional system that modern biochemistry is now mapping in astonishing detail. What stops me every time I sit with this material is the precision. It is not that the Bible happened to mention a few healthy substances. It is that the specific things it mentions, commands, and elevates as symbols of blessing, covenant, and sacred moment are the exact compounds that the most rigorous nutritional science ever produced is now identifying as among the most powerful healing substances on earth. That convergence demands something from us. At minimum, it demands our attention. It demands that we stop treating ancient wisdom and modern science as adversaries in a conversation and begin recognizing that they may be describing the same reality in entirely different languages. Before we close, I want to be direct. Nothing in this video replaces qualified medical care. If you are managing a chronic condition, please work alongside physicians who know your full history. Your healthcare team deserves to know everything you are consuming and why. What I am asking is that you stop treating the nutritional wisdom embedded in Scripture as something separate from your health strategy. It has earned its place in that conversation. It has the clinical evidence to back it up. Start small. Add one of these drinks this week. Brew hyssop tea before bed. Press a pomegranate and drink it fresh. Take 2 tablespoons of raw apple cider vinegar before your largest meal. Simmer bones low and slow on a Sunday and drink the broth across the week. Make ginger and honey in hot water every morning before you eat. These are not dramatic interventions. They are small, deliberate acts of honoring the body designed by a creator who understood your biology at a molecular level before the word molecule existed. He planted the solutions. He described them. He commanded them. He elevated them to symbols of his own holiness and promise. They were always here. We simply forgot to look. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these 10 biblical drinks surprised you most? Which one are you adding to your life this week? Put it in the comments right now, because your answer might be exactly what someone else scrolling through those comments needs to read today. If this opens something up for you, share it with 3 people in your life who are fighting for their health. Subscribe so you never miss what we are building here. And may the God who designed your body and who has never stopped caring about how you nourish it give you the wisdom to honor the temple He built specifically, intentionally, and lovingly for you.